This is Voluminous, a listening books podcast for every kind of reader, but especially for fans of audiobooks. I'm Jessica Stone, and because earlier this month we rounded up some audiobooks by our favourite narrators, we thought for this episode we'd like to talk to one of them about the craft of audiobook narration. So with me in the studio today is Bronwen Price, a voice actor who's done a number of audiobooks for listening books, including David Ulrich's Bonaventure trilogy, Rachel Ignatowski's Women in Science, 50 Fearless Pioneers, and Margot Sunderland's The Day the Sea Went Out and Never Came Back. Welcome back to the studio, Bronwen.
Thank you very much, Jess.
Is it weird being in here to do something other than read an audiobook?
A little bit strange, yeah. And I was saying before that not having headphones on, it's quite freeing. It's quite nice.
Oh.
Yeah, very different, very different. And you come without all that preparation as well. It's nice to kind of come and just think, I'm just going to have a chat.
Yeah. Oh, we're going to get to that preparation in a minute.
Yes.
Can you tell us first how you came to audiobook narration in your career?
Yeah, sure. So I come from an acting background, so I trained professionally. I did a lot of work on theatre, so a lot of stage work. And then I dabbled in a little bit of teaching as well. So I've taught English too. And sort of subsequently, I kind of had a small family and I felt I really needed to find a job that was a little bit more sort of within normal working hours. And so audiobooks and voice work within the acting world is, for me, certainly the closest you can get to sort of normal working hours.
That's interesting. I never thought about the practical side of it like that.
And it's interesting to see, actually, when you look in the acting world, how many people do move across because you just can't do the touring anymore. You can't do that you can't have that same lifestyle that you could when you were young, for many reasons, but certainly with a small family. And also, I think I was drawn to audiobooks as well because of my background in English literature as well. I did a degree in literature. You know, I have experience of teaching it as well. And so I suppose that both sides of my life, acting and literature, you know, come together in the idea of story and narrative. And I think audiobooks, in a way, sort of brings those together in a really lovely way. I think a lot of people actually have quite romantic notions about audiobooks as well. I mean, the reality is quite different. It's hard work. But there is something really quite magical about an audiobook. And, you know, I was brought up on audiobooks. Michael Hordern narrating The Magician's Nephew. You know, those kind of, and those really stay with you. And I think that certainly is something that very much drew me to it.
That's so interesting. And did you find yourself enjoying reading aloud as a child?
As a child, and then to my children as well, I suppose. I think this is everybody, you know, parents of new children discover in themselves a vast array of voices. You know, this is what you have to do. It's quite brutal sometimes. But yeah, I think it's something that is very much from one's own childhood, I think. I think that's almost in some ways why audiobooks are so popular as well, that just the joy of being read to.
Yeah.
It's a real basic human need, I think, and story and all that. So yeah, those are some of the things that drew me to audiobooks.
Oh, lovely. Yeah. And what brought you to listening books in particular?
So I was sort of looking around thinking I want to develop my my skills within audiobooks. And I thought, well, let's have a look around and see what there is out there. And so I just found them on the internet. I thought, well, the nice thing about listening books is not only is it sort of a place to, you know, obviously read books, but there's a sort of the educational slant to it as well. So from my background too, with working with children and with teenagers, that drew me as well. And it's such a good charity. It's a great thing to work for, really.
It is rather, isn't it?
Yeah.
If I do say so myself.
Yeah, well, of course.
I appreciate that your background is both in acting and in literature, because even though I have no sort of scientific basis on which to found this, I have a firm opinion nevertheless that readers make better actors.
Yes.
Not that every reader can act, but I do think it helps someone's acting if they are also good readers.
Absolutely. I think it's one of those things, when you're a child, I think if you're a voracious reader, you have that interest in human life and what it is to be a human and the varieties of humans there are out there, that then when you get a little bit older, you can explore more within your own life and then, you know, within your life as an actor. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
You mentioned before that people can have a sort of romantic idea about audiobooks.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about the disconnect between the romantic idea and the actual reality. How does it differ?
Ooh, okay, so there's a lot of work involved with an audiobook. Obviously in the preparation. Well, I say obviously, but I assume people would understand that you have to do quite a bit of preparation before you get into the studio, whether it's at home or an external studio. And then the actuality of recording a book, it's quite grueling, especially if it's a decent length book.
I mean, how many hours are we talking about?
Well, in terms of the actual finished hours or how long it takes?
Well, I'd say let's talk about just recording. If, just when you come in to record, I mean, how many hours of recording does it usually take?
Well, so for example, the Bonaventure trilogies took roughly 2 days each book. One of them went over a little bit, like an extra half hour or something. So at least 2 days for, a reasonable, a normal length book. And that's, pretty much going throughout the day. Obviously, you have to take breaks because you just can't concentrate that long, and you get very stiff, and you have to go to the loo constantly as well because you're drinking so much water. But yeah, so 2 solid days for a normal length book.
Yeah.
But then if you're recording at home, so I do that as well, it's a different beast altogether because then you can be flexible about it.
Right.
Take breaks in a different way, break it up. But you still want to keep the recording relatively close together because you want to keep the consistency.
Yes.
Is the issue.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit because I feel like I accelerated us through that bit. And actually, I want to go back to the preparation part of it.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about what you do to prepare before you even come into the studio to record.
Okay, well, I suppose it's obvious, but you read the book.
Now, one would hope.
Yes, indeed. I have heard there are some actors that don't, but it's not a good idea at all. I think you have to be incredibly experienced to be able to do anything like that. But yeah, so I personally like to read the book at least twice. Twice is a good, I think, a solid number. If you can do 3 times, brilliant. But often you won't have that kind of time. And the first time, I tend to I try to read it for enjoyment, for the story, to feel that the arc of the story, how it moves. And also, though I can't help myself, I have to write down the character names because I know I'm going to be coming back to those. So it's there's sort of a balance between a sort of relatively free read and there's an element of the forensic about it as well. So list those characters. I think it's a really good idea to have all those characters down then by the end of the book. So you're really clear in terms of who your main characters are, obviously. But then, of course, you come to the issue of differentiation of characters. So in the second read, I would look, amongst other things, I would look for more clues about the characters. So you'd make a note about what you know about them. And, having read it through the first time, what sort of changes might have gone on or whether there are any kind of secret surprises or actually turns out they're male after all. These kind of things, can be funny surprises. So so the second read would be adding to my bank of knowledge about the characters, thinking as well about sometimes it depends how the books are written, but some are really clearly punctuated, they're easy to cope with. Some can have quite lengthy sentences, so you might want to work in punctuation, thinking about ends of lines, full stops. If you are working from a text, which sometimes happens rather than a screen, you might want to be writing up for page turns, what's coming on the next page, all those kinds of technical bits which take a long time.
Yeah.
But if you prepare properly, then the time in the studio will be much more efficient. It will be spent much more efficiently.
How much of your time is spent double-checking pronunciations of names?
Well, that depends, of course, Jess, doesn't it? Quite a bit. I'm quite anal, which I think is probably a good thing in that, I care very much. And I usually know how to pronounce things, but of course there will be books like the Bonaventure trilogy stuffed full of dinosaurs and animals from around the world and different places and all kinds of different characters with different bits and bobs of different languages. So there was a lot of research in that. And even then I would come into the studio and Nick would say, oh, actually, I don't think that's right. Or I'd be like, oh, Nick, I didn't miss that one. What is that? Quick, look it up. So yeah, it can, again, dependent on the book always.
Nick, by the way, being our audio producer here at Listening Books,
of course,
which I think devoted listeners will know already because he has been on the show before. But with the Bonaventure trilogy in particular, there are a lot of characters and not all of them are human.
No, most of them are not, in fact, I think. Fine.
I mean, I think the premise is that there's a child, is her name Lucy?
Yeah.
The child who is the promised one, who can actually talk to animals and can understand them.
Yeah.
She can't, you know, and they understand her. And so you've got a lot of different animal characters along with human characters. And you've got a trilogy, so you've got them spread over 3 books. So I'm just wondering, how do you keep those characters straight then? Like, I mean, you've gone through the process of making your notes on what these characters are like and what they should sound like. Do you have to go back and listen to yourself?
Yeah, sometimes. Certainly, if you're between books, definitely, you need to be able to remind yourself because, you can't there's so many of them. But the joy, I suppose, about the Bonaventure trilogy as well, there's quite a lot of new animals each time. So, you know, it's stretching you in terms of sort of imaginative kind of ideas. But the key characters, though, the humans, the sort of most of them stay in place. The interesting thing, I suppose, about that one as well is there's sort of a passage of time as well. So because some of them are children, that sense of growing up as well. Do you change the voice ever so slightly for that? You know, and but it has to be so subtle because I think often a mistake you can fall into, or sort of trap you can fall into with doing character voices, that you overdo it. And you've got to remember that it's coming right into your listener's ear.
Yes,
it's an intimate, very intimate form of drama, as it were. And so I think when you characterise, it is very tempting to go over the top sometimes, but actually you need to be more subtle. And so then that becomes quite difficult in terms of differentiation between different characters. So actually the animals were easier in a way because of the obvious ones. I talked about this before. There's a harpy eagle that's really kind of like, I did it very rusty, you know, and that's quite straightforward. But then you have that series of monkeys that stay with Lucy. Queenie's there for a while, and how to differentiate between them. You don't want to make them ridiculous.
Right.
So, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
No, you are. And you're leading me sort of to my next question, which is really, and you're sort of answering it. You're in the process of answering it anyway. I'm just interrupting you.
No, please do.
But it's about how you actually do make those choices for creating a character. And kind of what brings us to mind, because you were saying you don't want to overdo it. And I know that in talking about this subject with other listening books staffers on the podcast previously, one of the common complaints really is when narrators overdo, in particular, gendered voices. So if they're doing the opposite gender, where men will sometimes adopt a very high falsetto type of voice to convey a woman's voice, and sometimes a woman might do the opposite and go very low until it's a bit ridiculous. And actually the bottom line is that it's just distracting, that it sort of just takes you out of it.
Absolutely, and that's the danger, and you mustn't do that.
Yes. So my question is then, how do you do this? How do you make so many distinctions and yet keep it subtle enough that it's not distracting?
It's tricky. I suppose perhaps this isn't to do with gender so much. Maybe I could come back to that later. But an audiobook I did very recently was set in Yorkshire. Obviously, I don't speak naturally in a Yorkshire accent, but they wanted the narration in a mild Yorkshire accent, and then all of the characters in Yorkshire as well. So for me, that was particularly challenging because it wasn't just a different accent for one character to differentiate. It was all of the characters in that accent. And the 2 main characters were both female, middle-aged Yorkshire women.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, oh, God, what am I going to do? Without pushing it too far. So I think what I think about sometimes what helps is they're thinking about the physicality of those characters. So one of them I had as she was going to be a bit heavier. And her pace was going to just be a little bit slower, and there was just a sort of a weightiness about her, a slight sadness perhaps as well, you know. So you just go in through those choices, those distinct choices you make, and then it starts to bring a character to life a little bit that will sit with the character that's been created by the author, if you see what I mean.
I do, yeah.
And then the other one was a lighter one. So she would speak with a light voice. She felt just lighter, and her physicality was smaller and more bird-like. So what really helps with that as well is sort of to remember the different voices. If you've got a physicality, then you take on that physicality when you speak them as well. So that helps enormously. It's sort of like a muscle memory.
What's really interesting to me as you're saying that is how much more to a character's voice there is than just, say, pitch or accent. That as you were saying that about remembering the physicality and when you're creating the voice, that, you know, the pace at which someone talks, we all have our different patterns as well. The way when I listen back to myself, and I have this sort of halting kind of way of talking and then suddenly galloping on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what makes it so interesting, I think, as well. It makes you real. That's your genuine voice, makes you really listenable too. And so if you can do that with a character, it's truthfulness as well, I suppose. I'm getting a bit actory about this, but it is about injecting truthfulness. And that's what makes people want to listen to stories, either in the writing or in the performance, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. Okay, so we've talked a bit about the preparation that goes into audiobooks before you even step into the studio.
Yeah.
I want us now to sort of virtually step into the studio.
Right.
And I want to know like even the silly things, like, do you do any vocal warm-ups before you start recording?
Yeah, yes. And indeed physical warm-ups as well.
Oh, really?
Well, I'm not some dreadful lovey that takes half an hour out there. Nick's twiddling his thumbs. But yeah, I think something, again, that one can forget, that it is a weirdly physical job in that you have to sit quite still for a long time, because you have to make sure that you're not messing about with the mic.
Yes.
Your relationship to the mic is really important, and you mustn't be moving around too much. So part of what I do is just the general sort of, loosen up shoulders, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the vocal warm-up where you find your breath, you warm up your mouth, you hum, you siren, all those kinds of actory things.
How do you find your breath?
How do you find your breath? That's a good point. I suppose, again, this comes back to the whole actor side of things, where you got to centre yourself physically. The breath is so connected with the body and with the emotion that if you're comfortable within your body, if you feel you're centred and you're feeling you're sort of there, and then you breathe into that, that's what I mean by finding your breath. I'm not sure if that's really clear, but that for me is what I like to do. And there isn't always time with other jobs as well. You're rushing in to do something, maybe not here, but another one. On your way, you have to try and find your body, find your breath before you even walk through that door. But it is really important that you can do that and you are in yourself, to be in the moment. Yeah, for the recording.
It's funny that just as you were talking about that, I realised I was sort of holding my breath.
Yeah. No, everyone now think, what are you doing with your breath? We do. And if you let it go, it feels so much better.
It does. Yeah. I know. Well, it's because I'm often on the other side of the microphone editing rather than actually being in front of it. I'm just aware of how loud breaths can sound, and so it's like I'm used to holding myself very, very still. In a recording situation like this, but it isn't actually great to do that with your breath.
No, but it's really hard, isn't it? So it is finding that middle way of being able to be still and yet loose in that stillness, and it's all about technique, I think, isn't it?
You're going to give me a little tutorial after this and show me how I can. So, is there a vocal warm up we could do now?
Right now?
Yeah.
Okay, a subtle one. Maybe one that you could do on the tube.
Maybe one that wouldn't hurt our listeners' ears.
That's a good idea. Yeah. Well, a really useful one is just humming.
Okay.
First of all. So if you just wherever you're comfortable, whatever note, just big breath in and then just sort of let it out. Let yourself relax into that hum.
So it's the relaxing bit that
it's
is
not about
tricky.
Making that humming noise. It's just letting the breath through.
Oh, okay.
Almost letting that breath out in a humming voice. Yeah, already I'm hoping, Jess, you're feeling more relaxed.
Yes.
More connected with your breath.
I could take a nap.
It's a small thing. Great.
Yeah. Amazing how much letting oxygen.
Yeah, remarkable. Who knew?
Oh, that's great. And what about any recording routines? Nick says that you usually take your shoes off when you are recording.
Yeah, I feel a bit uncomfortable having my shoes on right now, to be honest.
Oh, really?
I thought it might be a bit informal if I whip them
you're
on.
welcome to take them off. It's fine.
Yes, I'm glad you noticed that. Yeah, I take my shoes off because I like to be able to rearrange my legs. So I'm very aware I've got to keep my torso and head in the same place, but I can sort of shift my legs about when I'm doing a page turn. So I'm very clear about keeping this still, but I can move my legs around a bit, and I like to sit cross-legged sometimes or whatever. So I do that. I also like to have Vaseline because your lips get quite dry as well. That's something that you perhaps don't always think about, but you need to keep those lips nice and movable. And I always have my water as well, obviously. So those are the things I like to do. And then I get my chair in the right space. And obviously Nick checks out whether I'm in the right space, etc., and the levels are right. And then I'm really careful to not move that chair. That's my thing. So there's a number of rituals, I think. Don't think there's anything else particularly, or maybe Nick's noticed something that I do that I'm not aware of.
Oh, he didn't mention anything other than that.
Okay, good.
I was wondering if it was a more actory thing of like feeling more grounded.
Oh no, I do that outside when I'm warming up. I get that sense, and then when you're in, I think because it's a job, you've got to get on with it. You don't have time to do too much of that and feeling your set. And the point as well, I suppose, about working in a booth is you're not on a stage, you're not with other actors, you're not in a setting, it's not the same in that way. So you have to find it yourself in your mind. And with your preparation, if you've done that properly, then it should be quite easy just to sort of click into it.
Do you think about the listener at all when you're doing this? Like, I mean, in a normal acting scenario, I suppose you have the audience.
Yeah.
There is an audience there. I mean, I suppose even with television, there would be so many crew and stuff that there would be an audience.
There's a sense of performance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, again, I think this happens more in your preparation when you think about what type of book it is you're reading, you think about the genre, and you make certain decisions in terms of the narration and the tone and all that kind of thing earlier on. So I don't tend to sit and think, right, I'm imagining someone I'm talking to the whole time. I think of the microphone, I suppose, as an ear. And that sense of disclosing to the microphone. But again, it depends what sort of, not just what book you're reading, but what moments within the book you are at. So my favourite bits within books are obviously the more dramatic moments where things are happening and you have a sense of shift and a change and a pace. And then it becomes really easy when you have more sort of moments of exposition, when it's much more sort of narratorial, as it were, that's when I think you can sometimes come out of yourself. There's a danger there. So I think that can help thinking about, I'm telling this microphone this story. I'm telling this thing right here, right now. This is an ear. It is a listener. But I suppose with audiobooks, you never really know who it is going to be anyway, do you, really?
I have seen people, because I do the podcast and would know some other people who do podcasts and, you join Facebook groups and so on who it's about sharing what you've learned and whatever. And quite often people who have scripted podcasts will ask how they can sound more natural. Yeah. And very often someone will recommend that they put a little, like a plush toy animal in the studio with them and talk to the animal.
That's a very good idea. I mean, I do know voiceover artists who sort of work perhaps in the corporate world more, and I do a little bit of that as well. And there's one who has these sort of toy ducks he speaks to. And it depends on the mood of the piece, which duck he talks to. So it helps create that sense. But I think when you're doing a book, it's slightly different because you're evoking a whole world.
Right.
So, I think it can depend on what it is you're doing in the booth.
Do you ever worry about whether or not you're conveying what the author has intended?
Yeah. But you can't really afford to think like that when you're in the booth. Right. Again, it's in preparation. You do your best, but ultimately they've chosen you, or whatever, whoever's chosen you to do it, and you have to trust that they think that you can do it. And you it's about making clear decisions as well, I think, as is the case with all sort of acting world. You have to make a clear decision about characters that you're doing and the tone of the narration and what you're doing. You can't ever stop to question yourself once you've done that. I mean, it's what's really nice about working in a studio, say with Nick, you have a little bit of feedback. But when you work at home, you're doing your own home recording within your own studio, then you have nothing. And again, you just have to assume that they've liked your demo and you go with it.
There's so much for you to think about when you're in the studio because you're trying not to move around. You're trying to make sure that you're staying the same distance from the mic, that that your characters are consistent. Just focusing on reading the text in front of you intelligibly.
Without making mistakes.
That I'm curious whether in the case of books like Women in Science, 50 Fearless Pioneers, whether you were actually able to take things in and learn interesting things while you read them, or if you were just so concentrated on the the craft of it that really the content just kind of stayed where it was.
Again, I suppose I would say it's preparation again, isn't it? It's that you take that in. So yeah, you don't read the book and go, oh, that's interesting, because you will have read it before a couple of times. So
it's no longer as interesting.
No, but I think it remains a really valid question. And when you do all that research as well with words you don't know, then I think it does open up all sorts of things. It's reading, isn't it? I suppose, again, at the end of the day, you're reading a book, and you're reading a book that perhaps you might not have chosen to read particularly. Just so happens that someone thinks your voice would suit it.
Not talking about any book specifically.
No.
Yeah. Of course. We wouldn't name names.
Actually, I suppose that the positive thing about that is that it does then make you read something you wouldn't have thought to have read, and that can be interesting. But sometimes you do find yourself with a book where you're like, this is tough, because I don't personally connect with it, and so you have to work extra hard then again in that preparation time. That's what it is, and you've got to find a personal in.
So, have you developed any particular strategies
to cope?
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of hours to spend with it. I mean, especially if it's a book you don't actively enjoy, but if you actively dislike it.
Do you know, I've been lucky enough, I've never had a book that I actively dislike.
Oh, good.
So, maybe you need to ask someone else about that. I suppose I haven't had to really cope yet. I'm sure there'll come a day.
No, I think that's great. I wondered if perhaps you maybe had a policy of not reading things that you actively disliked.
Well, but this problem when you try to be professional about these things, you have to, you take things on. So, and it's good for you. Yeah. But I haven't yet had to deal with it.
Oh, good. Long may that continue.
Indeed.
Yeah. What sorts of books do you enjoy reading when it's up to you? What's your favourite sort of book to narrate?
Well, it's funny. I was thinking about this before, and I wouldn't say that there's a particular genre necessarily for narration. What I think is a real gift for an audiobook narrator is the voice that the book is written in. So if the author is good, is talented, and can create believable characters, it's just lovely if you have a book that's written in the first person through the voice of a character that is totally believable, is well rounded, and also speaks in a kind of an appropriate rhythm. If you see what I mean. I have done one quite recently like that, and it was just a joy to do. And you feel you go through her journey with her, and you, again, it's a gift for an actor. You embody that character, and you're sort of you're speaking almost like a monologue. So that's what I really enjoy. So I couldn't really say any particular genre. It just really does depend on that voice, I think, for me personally.
No, that makes sense. Do you have a sort of dream list? Like if I were to say, look, you could narrate any book by any author.
Ooh, yeah. No, that's tricky, because I know that I have got books that I love and authors that I love. I really enjoy, for example, Sarah Moss at the moment. I love Sarah Moss. I've read all her work, and I would, so in my head I'm like, I'd love to narrate that. But it'd be interesting actually to sit down and have a go at some of it, and then it might not be as delightful as I thought. You never know. I'm sure it is.
Do you do that when you're just reading a book for pleasure? Do you ever just say, I wonder if I could do this one effectively and just start reading aloud?
Sometimes, but I suppose
I do that.
Yeah. Do you? I suppose I do it less now, because I try to compartmentalise a little bit, because then you read for work and you read in a very specific way, and then you want to try and read for pleasure and not constantly have these characters' voices in your head, or trying to think about how you might do this and that and the other. But yeah, of course, sometimes.
I do think I've had, sometimes there's just an experience reading where you think this book is just, is written so beautifully and so lyrically, it's just meant to be read aloud.
Those cadences, that sort of sense of, Yeah. No, you're right. There definitely are some books like that, aren't there? And sort of classics. I was thinking as well the other day about reading Jane Austen. I think that maybe that wouldn't work so well. But other ones which have, Virginia Woolf would be interesting, I think, wouldn't she? Really
Absolutely.
Perhaps a little bit much after a while.
That takes a good bit of concentration, and talk about some complicated sentences. And
God, yes. So that'd be more like poetry, perhaps. I did record some poetry with Nick a while back as well, just for a little bit of a book.
Yes, Victorian verses, wasn't it?
And that actually, I really enjoyed that, because again, you have the rhythm. I love speaking Shakespeare as well. I know I wouldn't be allowed to do a Shakespeare audiobook because it's not an audiobook, but I do love speaking Shakespeare's verse. So poetry and verse is really nice to do from a really sort of self-indulgent perspective.
And I suppose related to this, aside from audiobook narration, when you just get to read what you want, you said you were reading a lot of Sarah
Yeah.
Any others sort of on the
recently
radar?
Sarah Perry. I've just read Melmoth, which was very interesting.
Oh, how was it? I've read The Essex Serpent, but I haven't read Melmoth yet.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I've also read The Essex Serpent and enjoyed it. I like her sort of quite lush prose. I enjoy the sort of historical aspect of it. Yeah, Melmoth was so it's contemporary. It was really good though. The Gothic element I found. Right. Yeah, although it doesn't feel it. There are moments, of course, within it that it sort of the historical moments and flashbacks and etc. But it was really interesting. And in terms of genre as well, the Gothic nature of it, I thought was really interesting. I think she has that kind of element to her writing as well as within the Essex Serpent, the monster and all that kind of. But it was sort of drawn out much more here. I would definitely recommend it.
It seems a bit more unusual to find the sort of Gothic style in a contemporary setting, and I think it's possibly harder to pull off.
Yes, and yet she does. I think very well.
Excellent.
Yeah, because of course, the more modern ones, you've got Woman in Black, who that's a modern story, but set in the past, isn't it? So you're right, it often is.
I mean, I think, and I won't be able to come up with the names of examples, but I think the ones that I'm thinking of, they kind of have to come up with ways of ignoring technology, because that sort of takes you out of the Gothic kind of style.
Yeah, the traditional Gothic style does, doesn't it? Yeah, no, you're right. I'm trying to think of others. There's The Little Stranger, isn't it, by Sarah Waters? Have you read that?
Oh, yes.
But that's set in the past as well. It's not the obvious Gothic past, but it's still past, isn't it?
I haven't read that particular one. I have read some other Sarah Waters books.
Read that one as well. It's terrifying.
Oh, really?
I'm easily scared, but yeah.
Well, so am I.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Well, I've got 2 things to add to my reading list now. And I know audiobooks aren't the only thing that you do in terms of your voice acting. Is there anything that you're working on now?
Right now? What have I now? I have just finished an audiobook recently. At the moment, I'm looking sort of within the corporate world. I do bits and bobs for the corporate world. So they're but they're very short jobs. So very, very different from audiobooks.
Do they pay better?
Oh, yeah. Of course they do. But you know what? I was thinking about it the other day that they, it still requires acting skills in that you have to think about your audience, you have to think about what you're trying to do, you have to think about how you're trying to affect them, who you are, so it's still, even though it might seem to people that are corporate video doing something for that, there's a lot of artistry going on, even for that sort of those very short moments. So
is there anything else that we haven't touched on that maybe the average person wouldn't think about, that is part of being an audiobook narrator? Have we missed anything? Or is this the sort of thing we think about after we've stopped recording?
Yeah, probably.
Yes.
Maybe we haven't talked about the technical side as well when you're recording it yourself. Because a lot of audiobooks now are recorded within people's home studios. There's a massive number. And so as an actor, there's actors across the land who over the last sort of 10, 20 years have had to hone their technical skills as well. And as creative people, it can be a bit tricky. So I think that's a real challenge. When you're not in a studio like here, you have to not only think about your characterization, consistency of characters, all that sort of that technical side of it, but you also have to be really aware of what you're doing with the mic as well. And because if you're going to be editing as well, or sending out to someone else to edit, you need to be thinking not only about breath, but about pops, clicks, those noises that your mouth makes, all that kind of thing. That's really hard. So what's really difficult is to have that technical hat on and be aware of all that, and yet at the same time keep on with your sort of truthful performance. So that's tough. So all of you listening, all you think, don't think about that because it'll spoil your experience. But But it is that sort of classic case of the more effortless it sounds, the more work has gone into it, really. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to come to us after a busy day. Oh, my pleasure. Are you on social media? I am. Yes, I am.
If listeners want to follow you, who should they look for?
They should look for, on Twitter, Bronwen Price.
Good, and that's Bronwen spelt with an E-N, right?
It is, yes, not with a Y-N.
Very good. And of course, you can find us on Twitter or Instagram at Listening Books, or Facebook at Listening Books 12. We'd love to hear from you. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, you can help others find us by linking to us on social media or by good old-fashioned word of mouth. I'm going to let Bronwen read our outro to show me how a professional does it.
Oh my goodness. Blind sight reading. Okay. Thank you. Voluminous is produced by Listening Books, a UK charity providing audiobooks for people with an illness, physical or learning disability, or mental health condition which affects their ability to read print or hold a book. If that's you or someone you know, you can find out how to access our more than 8,000 titles, including ones read by me, Bronwen Price, by heading to listening-books.org.uk.
Perfect.
Sure about that. Thank you. Thanks, Jess. Lovely surprise.